Good evening. Welcome to the Freedom of the Press event 2024 for the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. On behalf of the association in the United States and the community of international journalists that we serve, I want to welcome you all to the annual Press Freedom event. This is the first time we celebrate the program in Washington, D.C., but it is by inherent nature this very, very appropriate place to be. Looking in the audience, I see many familiar faces and several new ones. Welcome to you all. We are proud to have you as a vital part of our celebration. We need not tell this audience how significant is the protection of our journalists, our truth tellers. 30 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly established World Press Freedom Day as an opportunity to bring the international community together each year to recognize the importance of press freedom and the foundational role journalists play in supporting human rights and free societies. 2023 was the worst year on record for the death, incidental or intentional, of the brave men and women who literally put themselves in grave danger to report and hold accountable the atrocities that are occurring around the world today. They are truly the canary in the coal mine. With grave concern for those left behind, we honor this evening two brave journalists who were forced to flee Russia because of their commitment to truth-telling in a country that considers this value as an inherent threat. Please open the Press Freedom booklet, and you will see the bios, so I won't be redundant, but the bios are in front of you and you can read them at your leisure. We have recognized their impressive careers and accomplishments and their personal history of journalistic integrity. With these words, I would like to turn the stage over to the Press Freedom grantees, Mikhail, Rubin, and Elizaveta Kirpanova. Full bios, as I said, are found in the press booklet, and we have an evening of stimulating conversation for you all. Welcome. Panos, where are the statues? Right here, under the paper. Okay, so, Elizaveta, a memory for you, and we look forward to a very rich future that you have in store for you. Mikhail. Congratulations. Enjoy the program.
Hello. Thanks, Nancy, and congratulations to our honorees. We're delighted to have you here and to help in any way we can. I'm Bob Rowley. I'm the Vice President of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. More importantly, I'm a recovering foreign correspondent, so these issues are all dear to my heart. I spent many years at the Chicago Tribune, and I want to welcome our panelists today on the first panel, which is going to focus on reporting from exile in a dangerous world. We're delighted to highlight the journeys of our two grantees, both of whom had to flee Russia under threat of arrest in recent times. And I want to call to the stage a friend and longtime valued partner of the association, George Vigos, who's General Motors Executive Director of Communications and Global Markets. Come up, George, please. I have a couple more remarks, and then we'll start our panel. And General Motors is among many of the partners who are here today in our audience, supporting our work and mission in journalism and education. And again, welcome to our panelists. World Press Freedom events come at a time of increasing peril to journalists around the world, including the threats of violence in our own country as we head into the conventions. An unprecedented number of journalists, notably nearly 100 at last count, have been killed in Gaza, some of them reportedly targeted. It's a staggering death toll for our colleagues who are civilians and should be protected by international law. As many as 36 other journalists died on the job in other parts of the world last year, and hundreds of others are jailed unjustly around the globe, like Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Alsu Kurmasheva, who has been both of them wrongfully detained in Russian prisons. In fact, Nancy and I, an association board member, Alex Raufala, met today with Pavel Butorin, Alsu's husband, who has been telling her story and seeking support tirelessly for the long 6 months that she has been in prison. So Alex, where are you? Would you stand up for a second? Thank you. Give us a quick recap of the meeting and what message he gave us, that Pavel gave us.
Sure. Bob, thank you so much, Nancy, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Like Bob said, we met with Pavel this morning, prior to his departure. He has been in town for a couple of days. He had to go back to Prague. He's a reporter. He's the husband of Alsu Kurmasheva, an American citizen, American journalist based in Prague. And she got jailed in Russia. The few words we heard from Pavel today, I wanted to convey on his behalf. Pavel said that also she is just a correspondent, just like one of us. She is not an activist. She is not a spy, definitely. She is not a opposition party member. She went to Russia just because she wanted to see her mom, and she got jailed in Russia for 7 months. This week is going to mark 200 days of her being jailed in Russia. The US State Department has not yet designated her detention as wrongful. I think we all agreed with Pavel that we will not stop fighting until we get Evan Gershkovich, also Kurmasheva, and the rest of our colleagues free from Russian jail. And we have to press the State Department. Please keep asking, just like I do. All of us have to keep doing it until we get her designated wrongful. We need to use every single tool possible to get our colleagues free from Russian jail. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Alex. He also talked about Pavel's two daughters, age 15 and 12, and the poignant messages that they sent their mom. And there was hope because President Biden finally mentioned her in a public setting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. That has given some hope to the family. But we need to, as journalists and supporters, do everything we can to keep raising awareness, to keep her name front and center with the US government, the UN, and sympathetic nations. And so we call on all of you tonight to do what you can to help on that front as time goes by. And thanks to the many of you already who have been out there working on these issues. I know you have many people at the press club as well. Our organization is now also deeply concerned about Russian journalist and political leader Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of the latest detainees as well. And many other reporters, as you know, face threats, intimidation, censorship, and lawsuits around the world, simply for reporting the truth in their home countries. So let's get to the panel now. The number of journalists forced into exile has nearly doubled in the past year by one reliable estimate, as hundreds of people flee their countries. Today we honor Mikhail and Liza, not just with these grants, but more broadly, because their examples signal this growing problem of reporters in exile and the vital importance that our organization and others find ways to support them and their work. Let's move over to you guys can share. On to the panel. Liza, let's start with your story, if we may. Again, the recap in the booklet is good, but there's so much more about these two journalists that is worth knowing. I know, for example, that Liza's a Harry Potter fan like me, although more Hermione, and she actually tried to start writing her own version of Harry Potter back when she was growing up. She's also reported from the high Arctic and done some other amazing things as a young journalist. So can you talk, Liza, a little bit about what motivated you coming from your hometown of Rubinsk? You came to Moscow State University, among the most prominent in the country. What sparked your interest in journalism? And you moved on to Novaya Gazeta, which is Russia's premier independent news organization, and as we all know, won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Thank you, Bob, for having me here. Yes, you mentioned that I grew up in a very small town. Small town by Russian standards, not very small by American standards. And as a kid, you've mentioned I was a Harry Potter fan, and I wanted to write my own story of Harry Potter. But this book inspired me, inspired my writing. And as I was growing up, I realized that I can actually do something with my writing. I can use my words to change things. And when it was time to decide what my bachelor's degree would be, I decided that journalistic career is perfect for me because it could combine writing and making a difference. So I got a spot at that time, one of the best journalistic schools in Russia. It's not very good now, because now it's completely under control of the government, and it's censored, and there is no future for young journalists who study there. But at that time, when I was there, there's still some space for us to grow as journalists. And there was one course in particular, political journalism, that I loved and that inspired me, and that showed me that there are independent media outlets in Russia that do great job, and one of them was Novaya Gazeta. And during my last semester, I had struggles, financial struggles, so I really wanted to find a job. And I applied, I sent my resume to every possible media, and the only one who actually replied to me 6 months later was Novaya Gazeta. And it was my first and my last full-time job as a journalist, and I couldn't be more prouder to be a part of such great editorial office who did so many great things, saving people, helping people, protecting human rights, protecting freedom of speech, freedom of press. Yes, and I couldn't be more proud of my boss, who won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. And I miss my colleagues very much. It's hard for me to be not around them.
Yeah, it's also incredibly dislocating to come to work in a second language in a new country, in a different culture. It's an extremely grueling experience to have to go through. So I also remember your work at Novaya Gazeta inspired your father as well, because he was out protesting in favor of Navalny, and actually they came looking for him and fined him for being a single man in a peace demonstration, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So Rubinsk, the small town I grew up, there is no politics in there. So my family, before I went to work for Novaya Gazeta, were completely didn't really know what was happening in the country, because there was no access to good media in our small town. But when I started working at Novaya Gazeta, my dad read my reportings, he read other articles from my newspaper, and he got interested and he got inspired. And well, I guess I got a keen sense of justice from him too, because he got politically active. And when protests in Russia happened after the arrest of the Alexei Navalny, Russian opposition leader, my dad was the only one who went out to protest on the streets. And he was the only one on our main square in the town having a banner saying, I don't remember what exactly it was saying, but it was something about Free Navalny. And obviously, when you live in a small town like mine, it's very easy for police or for other governmental officials to find you, and they did. And they gave him an administrative charges, and one more could lead to a criminal case. So my dad took my mom and my younger brother, and he decided to leave the country even before I left the country.
Good, and they're both your parents are safe now as well, which is good. Same question, Mikhail, about motivation. Before you were an award-winning investigative TV reporter, when you were young, your scientist father used to talk about physics, and it sort of put you to sleep. But when you talk about politics, you would come wide awake with interest. And that's kind of what motivated you to go to a preeminent university, higher school of economics, study political journalism. Is that where your motivation came from?
Yes, I think it's all coming from my father. But, well, to tell you the truth, today, now, when I was getting this award, thank you very much, I remember the true story, how I decided to be a journalist. Actually, really, right now. No, but to start from the beginning, I grew up in Moscow, and it was 1990s, the only period when it was a democracy in Russia. So, and my parents were really happy about, well, it was a very difficult time for them, especially to find some food for us. But on the other hand, they were really happy about the democracy in Russia. And my father, yes, while we were walking with him, when he was taking me to the park, he would try to talk about physics with me because he wanted me to be a scientist. But then he realized that I'm getting totally bored and I understand nothing. But when he was talking about politics, about history, about even the Second World War, he's quite old, I got interested. So yeah, as long as I remember myself, I think I'm interested in politics. But I didn't know, to tell you the truth, who to be, because you're interested in politics, what are you going to do? And I don't remember the particular time, but once when I was a child, I turned the TV on and I saw that there was a ceremony of awarding some journalists. And they were giving like also some statues to them. And I decided, wow, you could get awards for this job. So maybe that's why I became a journalist.
And you've won many. He's very distinguished with the number of awards he's won. But you also started out with internet media. You learned sort of how to be a backpack online journalist reporter, as we teach in J schools, and you worked for Izvestia, RBC, and TV Rain, which is another really well-known and famous independent media. And eventually you came to Project, which was the premier or one of the premier investigative independent media.
Yes. Well, I went to, as I was interested in politics, I worked for most part of my career. I worked in political departments of different newspapers and then in TV channel Rain. For a political political journalist, it was interesting for me to be a part of Kremlin pool. So for 4 years, I covered Putin's agenda, flying with him and coming to Kremlin. But unfortunately, it turned out to be not that interesting as I expected, because as I worked for independent media, they didn't like me very much in Kremlin, so they even didn't allow me to cover his agenda for real. They tried not to allow me to see him, not to ask him a lot of questions, but still it was a very interesting experience. But unfortunately, the truth is that before coming to this independent media, who Kremlin absolutely don't like, in the beginning of my career, I was working in one of the in the oldest, I guess, Russian newspaper, Izvestia. And at that time, the censorship started, and I had to leave it when I found out that Kremlin is sending directly an articles which they're interested in, and Kremlin is publishing it. That's how I had to, I understood that I don't want ever to see my newspaper where I work, ever to see Kremlin newspapers coming from Kremlin. That's a terrible thing that nowadays, living in Russia, you cannot find a newspaper who can say no to Kremlin when they call the editor-in-chief and say, put this. Unfortunately, these days, if you want to live in Russia, you have to put the articles which are sent by Kremlin sometimes. If you don't, you have to be in exile.
Yeah. George, I want to bring you into this conversation. You, pre-GM, you have an amazing background. You're from Australia, but you've worked all over the world, South Korea, Thailand, Singapore, now Michigan. And your family has known what it's like to be in exile. I think years ago, your great-grandparents were displaced and dispossessed in Greece by the Turks and by the economic situation at the beginning of the 20th century.
use this one? Okay.
Use that one.
So I should first say that I'm humbled to be sharing the stage with Mikhail and Lisa, and I will keep my remarks brief so we can hear more from them about their stories. But very briefly, a lot of the same inspirations. I started my life wanting to be a journalist. I had to deal with my dad, who was a doctor. He said, you can be any profession you want as long as you get into medicine. Then you can choose whatever you want to do after that. And so was drawn to journalism by the political discussions in our house, but definitely not the medical or scientific discussions in our house at all. But in contrast, I had the privilege of being able to move from journalism to politics to corporate in my home country. And I think it's a very salient contrast to the life experience that you've had to date. And like most people growing up in the West, didn't realize my privilege for a very long time. I was confronted with it when we went to Greece for the first time. My sister and I took my parents there, and we saw the homes that our grandparents were forced to flee in the 20s, fleeing abject poverty, and not because they didn't originally have money, but because all their possessions were taken from them. And it made me reflect on my own life, where I've had what my wife calls a boulevard of green lights in my life, where I've been able to move around the world with a degree of comfort, but to think of how terrified my great-grandparents must have been to board a ship, go to the other side of the world, not speak the language, not know anything about what would be at the end of that trip, but have to do it out of desperation. I mean, that's something I think that stays with them for life, but then gets passed down into the generations after that.
Yeah, and they worked hard in Australia to make way for you. But I do love that you worked for Rupert Murdoch for a while in News Corp.
I don't,
when you were
but
there.
okay.
Well, it was a way in. I started out as a crime reporter working in cop shops, and it was great experience. So I think that brings you to us a little more. I think there's more empathy in you because you actually did this job for a while. And as a communicator, it helps you with your role in GM, I would say, I would guess.
Yeah, and I think, and some of the other partners for the association are here as well. And I think one of the things we have in common and why we choose to work for American companies is because of the values that those companies have. Yep. And sure, we're for-profit companies and we're out there to get a return on shareholders, but I think as an individual, you have to be able to identify the values of your company with your own personal values. And the minute that doesn't jive, then you probably shouldn't be there, right? So I think that's an important carryover from previous career choices in my life.
Yep. So Lisa, let's go back to you. You covered human rights and immigration and healthcare. Those were some of your big stories. You helped spur the Russian government to finally fund some vital health issues, especially regarding spinal muscular atrophy. And you even braved the dangers of Chechnya to go cover part of that story. Harrowing stories when you described them. You've also covered demonstration, and you were beaten in one of those demonstrations by the police. But it was Russia's war in Ukraine, I think, that kind of changed everything for the media, what freedom there was, what independence there was. Reporters break the law in Russia now by just using the word war. So were these the stories? Was it the Ukraine story that sort of brought it to the point in the newsroom at Novaya Gazeta where you had to leave?
Yes. It may sound surprising, but before the war in Ukraine, we, as a journalist, obviously experienced, and Misha will agree with me, so many different types of pressure from the government. It could be threats from troll factories associated with Yevgeny Prigozhin, or it could be, I was surveilled once by a car at the far north, actually. I was beaten by the police, as you've mentioned it, and no one was punished for my beatings, although even the European Union called upon sanctions against those responsible. We received lawsuits from Russian media watchdog. We lost them. So there were so many things that we've experienced as independent journalists. When my boss, Nobel Peace Prize winner, Dmitry Muratov, won the prize, we actually thought that maybe it's not that bad. We thought that this award could give us some immunity for a while, but we were wrong because a couple months later, the war started. The new laws have been signed by Putin censoring our job. We literally couldn't publish the word war in Ukraine because it was supposed to be called a special military operation. Right after the first articles published in our newspaper, we received notices from Russian media watchdog. We realized that if we continue to publish them without censorship, it could get worse. So we suspended our work for a while, but then we realized that even with suspension, we are still under the threat of constant arrest. So most of my colleagues, and me included, we left the country. My colleagues, most of them believe now in Latvia or in Germany, and they even founded media in exile, which is called Novaya Gazeta Europe, which is not affiliated with Novaya Gazeta, but founded by Novaya Gazeta journalists. And I work for them right now. I'm not an official staff, but I still try to stay in touch with my colleagues and still try to do something for the audience at that part of Europe, because most media outlets are either closed or blocked in Russia, and the only one who actually publish some truth are the media in exile. So I try to contribute to Novaya Gazeta Europe as much as I can right now.
For which we're all grateful. Mikhail, you covered some controversial stories for years before you left, and you actually left before the Ukraine war started, working for Project and others. Two in particular were prohibited topics as an investigative reporter, red lines for Vladimir Putin, both involving his personal life. One uncovered facts about money and business he gives his family and friends, including his secret girlfriend and the money they all received, money she received, underscoring high-level corruption in the country. The other was a verboten subject about his health. You're not supposed to touch the health issue, and the fact that he traveled with a group of doctors. Are these the main reasons that you had to leave? And I remember you came home one day after multiple searches of yours in your parents' apartments, and your passport was left on the kitchen table as if it was an indication, get out of town.
That's an interesting story. Actually, in 2018, I decided that I don't want to be anymore a part of a newspaper and to be a news journalist. I wanted to be an investigative journalist, just because we all understood what's going to happen in Russia. Well, I didn't anticipate the war, but we all understood that it is a dictatorship. So I just wanted to conduct investigations and find out what is going to happen. So my boss launched the project, which is an investigative media, and invited me to become his deputy. And our idea is that we want to cover those topics which are totally prohibited. So we are not that kind of media that covers all the agenda. We cover, it is only prohibited topics, those which not any other media is going to cover. This is our agenda. So what is, Bob said it, what is prohibited in Russia? There are two absolutely, especially before the war, there were two absolutely prohibited topics: Putin's personal life, and it's not because we are interested in his girlfriends or whoever. It is because it is a huge money. Every time he gives his lovers, his women, his children, he gives a lot of money of Russian taxpayers and a lot of lands. The situation, every time when we uncover something, I'm thinking of, wow, it's like the time of Russian czars back in 300-400 years. This is how this system is working. This is what we were and we are now still trying to cover. So in 2020, we found Putin's secret lover, whose name is Svetlana Krivanogih, and his secret daughter. So we found this, and we understood that it is going to be the beginning of an end for us. But like Russian officials are quite they're slow, so it took them a half of the year to decide what to do with us. So we just, for the half of the year, we just were funding of propaganda TV, Russian propaganda TV channels, because before that they never mentioned us, because independent journalists do not, there are no independent journalists officially in Russia. We were, but they tried not to mention us. And then during this half of the year, after this investigation, we were seeing a lot of talk shows mentioning that there are these terrible journalists who are American agents, of course, and telling bad stories about our dear president. And then, they solved this problem easily. In June, I remember the dates, of course. In June 2021, I woke up seeing that some strange phone numbers were calling to me. It was like 5 or 6 in the morning, and I didn't realize what's going on. And then I realized that the police was trying to geolocate where am I, especially to find it with the phone. Then my colleague called me and told that, oh, wow, I'm having a police trying to enter my apartment. I took a car, went to her apartment, and when I was leaving the taxi, I heard some strange people shouting at me, "You busted, stop." And there was a police taking me like this. They brought me and searched my parents' apartment first, mine apartment, and at the end of this search, what they did, they were interested only in my phone, in my laptop, something like that, dictaphone. And then at the end, they found my foreign passport. So in Russia, we have 2 passports. And that one that gives you an opportunity to go abroad. They found this passport. They put it in front of me and left. So I thought, wow, that's a kind of a sign. And yeah, maybe I need to do something. In 2 weeks, we were named undesirable organization. These days, I'm proud to say that we were the first Russian media to be named undesirable organization. Working and being an editor in media undesirable organization can bring you to prison for 6 years. So the next day I left the country.
What a harrowing story. And we're just about out of time, but I want to ask very quickly our 2 Russians. You went by different paths to get here when you left. You had a harrowing journey, a month-long journey, Lisa, that ended up in the border at Tijuana. You came across, you were detained for a number of days there in Louisiana. And it's a story that you should ask her about at the reception or read her piece about. But you chose to go for asylum. You've been very lucky. You found a great lawyer in Atlanta, and you won your asylum, or you're on the path to getting it. Why did you choose asylum, say, as opposed to continuing to get a visa? Because Mikhail's had some issues of a different kind. And it's an issue something that we can help with if all of us work. I know the National Press Club, Rachel Oswald here in the second row, has been so good, and the Press Club has been so good working this issue, and I think it's something we can all do more on. But I'm just interested in your legal status and how you survived being here. So briefly, asylum.
So now that I'm trying to analyze this situation, why I chose asylum process, I wouldn't recommend this path because it's very difficult, it's very dangerous. But at that time when we were leaving Russia, I was scared, I was panicking. Every time in our apartment in Russia, when the elevator doors were opening and closing, I thought that the police is coming to our apartment to search and to arrest us. So we didn't really have time to think clearly. So we just packed everything that we had in 2 small suitcases and left the country, went to Dubai, went to Yerevan. Couldn't stay there for long because both Armenia and United Arab Emirates have very not very good extradition laws. If, for example, a criminal case is opened against you, then you will most likely be extradited. So I couldn't risk that. And since my parents were here, it could only make sense that I come join them. But the only way to do that was to cross the border and request an asylum. The immigration system here in the US is not perfect, to put it mildly. I could apply for a visa, but 100% I would be denied because, again, I had family here. And when you have a family, that means to the consul, to the embassy, that you have you don't have strong ties with Russia. That's how we explain exile. And I obviously already left Russia because of a possible risk of persecution. So I didn't have any ties with Russia, and my parents were already here. So I went to Tijuana, the most dangerous city in the world. I saw some terrifying stuff. I would never go back. But again, I knew that I had a right to seek asylum, and I used this right, and my right was fulfilled. And I'm very grateful to the US to giving me this opportunity to stay here, to be safe, and to continue my job.
As are we. And Mikhail, briefly, you've gotten a visa, you've gotten some very impressive fellowships, and that helps you stay for a while, but you actually left and were in Belgrade, and the US Embassy took your passport, took your visa away.
Yes, unfortunately, that's the problem Lisa was partly saying of it. Unfortunately, the system, the US system for exiled journalists is very difficult. You either have to be a refugee and seek for refugee, but then you have to be in the country. You cannot leave it. You cannot go to. We do need to go to Europe sometimes to meet some of our sources. So that wasn't a way for me. So I'm on a J visa here. It's an exchange visa, and that's it. So there are no other types of visas for us. So yes, I got the fellowship at George Washington University, which gave me a great opportunity to be here. And my fellowship, I've came here in 2022, and in 2023 my fellowship was exceeded, and so I had to go to any foreign country to get a new visa. And what they did, I went to Belgrade, to Serbia, and they asked me in the embassy, "Oh, okay, you're seeking for one more year in the United States. Tell us, please, how and when are you going to return to your home country, which is Russia?" Well, that's the job. And well, unfortunately, I was too honest, and well, it's easy to find. They could Google, and I honestly told that, well, it's difficult for me to return to my home country, but I'm going, if I need to, I'll definitely go to Europe. There will be no problem. They didn't believe me, of course, and what they did, they revoked my visa, even not allowing me to, because I had one more month maybe of my visa, just to be able to return to pack things. And they told, no, we are revoking it right now. So I had to spend a month in Europe seeking for help of different organizations, which were, thank you them very much, and a lot of people and organizations helped me. But it was a month of huge efforts of serious organizations, great people, well, myself, trying and pushing to get just a J visa, yeah.
And you finally found one in Vilnius. You got it
Vilnius,
renewed by a country next door who kind of understood exactly what your issue was.
That's a very interesting system. It absolutely depends on understanding. There is no system. It's an embassy who could be understandable or not. So in Belgrade, they don't care. In Vilnius, in Lithuania, they do understand that if you're Russian, that maybe you don't need to return there. So they gave me the visa with no problems. So
I want to thank George for giving me extra time to interview our panelists. I really want to thank our panelists and congratulate you again. I encourage you to meet them at the reception and hear more about their stories. They're incredible people doing incredible journalism, and anything you all can do to raise awareness about this issue, to support these kinds of journalists in exile. It's a growing critical problem and a critical press freedom issue, and we're delighted you could join us today. Thank you all.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Cecil McCarthy, a board member and executive officer of the AFPC and the director of the journalism program at Hunter College. Thank you to our panel, Bob, George, Lisa, and Misha. So interesting to learn your story and reminding us how dangerous it is to be truth tellers in today's world and how courageous journalists are who are holding people to power to account. And they're not calling it in. They really are on the front lines in this fight for press freedom. Before we get to the next panel, we are going to hear from Rasan Johnson, a managing director of international communications at Delta. Rasan? There you are.
I need to yell at Thanos. How do I follow that group, right? That's tough thing to do, but thank you for all you're doing. He did ask me to keep it brief, and I will do that. I had several thoughts running through my head, and literally just lost most of them just watching this group here. But like many of you and like many of the members, I also got a journalism degree, University of North Carolina, class of 1995. And then decided to go into corporate communications. I've worked for airlines for the better part of 25 years. And for the last 2 years, in particular, I've been doing international communications with a team that focuses on media relations outside the US. And I'd say 48 years old, 29 years out of college, journalism degree. And it has literally been just in the last 2 years of doing this job, meeting journalists on 6 continents, talking about aviation and sustainability and economic development, that I've come to appreciate what it means to have freedom of the press in the United States and what it means to not have freedom of the press in so many parts of the world. And so I think I will just say, on behalf of 100,000 people at Delta, 2 of my colleagues here, Lizzie and Anna Catherine, thanks for coming. Thank you all for what you do, and keep at it, and we're here with you. So thank you all.
All right, and now it is time to introduce our Foreign Press Awardee for 2024, Jonathan Karl. You're about to get this. Put it right there. John has been a journalist for more than 30 years and is now the chief Washington correspondent for ABC News and co-anchor of This Week with George Stephanopoulos. He's also the former president of the White House Correspondents Association and the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, Front Row at the Trump Show and Betrayal. His foreign press bona fides are also impressive. He has reported from more than 30 countries covering foreign policy and the military. He has reported on 8 presidential elections and from the White House during 4 administrations. He's covered every major beat in Washington, including Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, and the State Department. He's won numerous awards for his work, some of which include the National Press Foundation Award for Congressional Reporting, the Walter Cronkite Award, and the Radio and TV Correspondent Association's Award for Excellence, not once, but twice. And we are delighted to add to your accolades, John, with this 2024 Foreign Press Award. You can take a seat. We're going to get started right away with the panel. Joining us for our panel, which is called The Fight for Press Freedom, What's Next, is Eileen O'Connor, the Senior Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation and a former journalist, also at ABC News and CNN. Cameron Batten, the Chief Communications Officer at Volkswagen America, and Damon Jones, Chief Communications Officer at Procter & Gamble. Now, before we dig into what's next for press freedom, I do want to share some good news. A large majority of Americans, actually 73%, see press freedom as highly important to the well-being of society. And even better news, people in both political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, agree with that statement. These findings came from a new Pew Research Center survey just released ahead of World Press Freedom Day. Of course, at the same time, there are so many challenges facing journalists in this period in our history when journalism could not be more important. So let's get started and talk about what's next for this fight for press freedom. And I'd like to start with you, John. What is your assessment of the state of press freedom here in the US as we head into the 2024 elections. Would you say we're heading in the right direction or the wrong direction, or does that depend on the election results?
Well, can I first say I was blown away by the last panel and just thank the two of you. I am so humbled by your work. I love the idea of a publication dedicated solely to forbidden topics. That may be the coolest, mission statement I've ever heard for a news publication. Mikhail, so thank you. Elizaveta, really amazing. Look, I think we have some real challenges here, and a lot does depend on what happens in the election, candidly. I spent the entirety of the 4 years of the Trump administration covering that White House. And it was in the very early days that Donald Trump declared that a free press is the enemy of the people. And I felt it was my duty to continue to report on that White House in as objective a way as I could possibly do so, and not take the fact that the guy that I'm covering has just called me a traitor to my country. And what I tried to do, because I had a relationship with Trump that had gone back to the 1990s, to try in my conversations with him and in my reporting to impress on him the implications of what he was saying. And there was a particular meeting I had. I was president of the White House Correspondents Association, and Trump had basically summoned me to the Oval Office to complain about coverage of partly my coverage, but really coverage of the news of a variety of news organizations. And over the course of the conversation, this meeting took place shortly after the mass shootings that we saw at El Paso and Dayton. There was and is an epidemic of violence in our country. And he was out there calling the press the enemy of the people. And I said to him, and this was really in my capacity, not as a journalist for ABC News, but as the president of the White House Correspondents Association, I said, aren't you worried that when you use a phrase like that people will take your words to heart? They will act on them. And without missing a beat, he said to me, I hope people take my words to heart, because fake news is the enemy of the people. And look, he wasn't, I don't think, saying that he wanted somebody to go off and do what you would do with enemies of the people. A phrase, by the way, that was used during the French Revolution to justify those that were sent, those that were sent to the guillotine. But it was just no kind of understanding, empathy, an idea that people could act on his words. So I am really worried, because the environment has become considerably more toxic since that moment.
And you did say in your book that his war on truth could do lasting damage to American democracy.
Well, I think that one of the real problems we have in our country right now, it's not one person, it's not Donald Trump solely, it's not even entirely a partisan issue. We have a situation where our divisions as a country are not simply a reflection of political differences, but literally a difference in how we view the world, the facts. We don't have a common set of facts anymore. You remember the phrase that it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan first said, you're entitled to your opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. But increasingly we have
alternate realities.
Literally alternative realities. And how do you overcome differences if you can't even agree that day is day and night is night?
And of course, the U.S. is not the only country with a big election. According to the New York Times, there are 80 elections around the world this year. Eileen, how would you describe the state of press freedom abroad?
Well, I think it's very similar to the United States, and I would say that this war on truth goes across the universe, and it also is very much involved with social media and technology. It's political pressure. It's also the blowing through of political norms. I was at tea with President Putin in 2004 at his dacha outside of Moscow with a lot of Russian experts, so-called. I don't ever consider myself a Russian expert. I don't know of anyone who's a Russian expert. Perhaps you guys, except for you all. No, I mean, it's but basically I asked him, why were you cracking down on independent media when you had said so much that you wanted to fight corruption, and independent media is a way to fight corruption? And he said, there is no independent media. Whoever owns the media owns the truth. And unfortunately, that has become a reality. The economic consequences for journalists are very bad. There's been a consolidation in ownership by major corporations since the 1980s, and one of the things, the consequences of that is reducing the expenses of covering the news. So when I started ABC, we had 29 bureaus around the world. 1978, that's a very long time ago, 29 bureaus. We don't go to war zones for weeks on end anymore. And so that affects press freedom everywhere. And the other thing is, this enemy of the people in the United States, the consequences of cracking down on free and independent media in the United States has consequences in other countries, because it becomes excusable in other countries to attack the media, and there is no consequences. And so I think that, when there is no truth, there is no democracy, because we cannot have good policy. We cannot have a good debate about what is good for the people if we don't have the truth. So I would also say this: one of the biggest problems we have with this upcoming elections is this conversation around the presidential powers and a unitary executive. And if you have a unitary executive, it means that the independent agencies of this federal government and the norms around independence of agencies, like the Department of Justice, like the FCC, like the Federal Reserve, like all of these agencies, and particularly things like the FCC, there will be a war on journalism. And one of the things I did is covering war zones. The first casualty of war is the truth. And we see, and it also is this creating us and them enemies has always been, in my view, as a war zone correspondent, the way that we create war. And I think we're seeing it in our country, we're seeing it in other countries, and I think the consolidation of the news media, the fact that we don't have a great economic model for the news media, and social media pushing us into information silos creates this division and just turbocharges it.
And real threats to press freedom. And Damon and Cameron, I'd like to talk to you about the threat to press freedom through the failed economic model for journalism. Approximately 2 local newspapers are closing every week, leaving an information vacuum that is being filled by other media. Margaret Sullivan calls it pink slime sites, because they look like news sites, but they're actually run by political parties or by PR firms. So my question for Damon and Cameron: how can we underwrite the journalism, particularly at the local news level, that we need in our country for democracy to function?
Yeah, don't know that I have the complete answer to that, but I think, companies play a responsible role as stewards of their investment in media, right? If I step back and I think about Procter & Gamble, we're one of the world's largest advertisers. How we think about placing those ad dollars, not from a standpoint of endorsing what independent journalists do or other journalists do. That's not our role, but it is our role to make sure that there are environments that are truthful, that are fact-based, that tell and reflect people accurately. Right? If we think about even the content that we create in the private sector, one of the things that's important, if you think about the advertising that you see, do you see people reflected accurately, consistently?
Representation.
So yes, representation matters, but what are the storylines, right? And when we talk about, people of different nationalities or races or sexual identities, right? All of those things matter. So I think it is a bit leading by example in the content that we create, because that is also something that people take into account as they form their opinions about their own communities and other communities, but also making sure that we're great stewards of the advertising investment dollars that we make, and being just very thoughtful and very deliberate in that.
Thanks for having us. I really understand the local journalism angle. My mother was a columnist in North Carolina from 73 to 79. She ultimately went into nursing because she couldn't support 2 children. She had to make an economic choice. That publication has long since closed its doors. And so when I think about like the role that corporations play in this insurance of press freedom, there's a few things. One, access. I'm sure depending on which administration you're covering, there's been varying degrees of access. And so I wouldn't say at Volkswagen we have had a long history of great access for our leaders or our products or our places, our factories. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that we're very transparent in providing that access. And that's really, really important for a storyteller to get their story, regardless of their domestic or international. I would say the second is, as someone who knows the local media angle, it's some of the basic things like buying subscriptions. I have a subscriptions contact in my mobile phone that has my passwords to 25 different subscriptions that the PR department pays on behalf of the PR department. And that's very, very important. It's a small thing, but it's very, very important in terms of that vitality. And then I think, to Damon's point as well, like we also look at where our brand is showing up from a safety perspective, a diversity perspective, and just providing, again, access to opportunity. We do an interesting a program with HBCUs. It's called the Drive Internship, where we just try to show journalism students what the opportunities are in covering automotive media. And that could range a whole host of things, from broadcasting to photography to editing. And we do that in multiple ways through experiences, both visiting Volkswagen and then obviously providing our products to support it. So I think there's several ways.
John, do you want to weigh in on the business model and how it's changed and what the future could look like?
Well, look, journalism is an important part of a functioning democracy. And when you have an utter breakdown of local journalism, you have a problem. There is not a watchful eye on local decision makers. So I think it's a fundamental problem we're facing. I think there's some good work that's trying to push up against this. I mean, my friends at Axios are trying to create a network of kind of of mini bureaus all around the country, but they're up against a massive tide of failed newspapers, local television news that's been stripped of resources. Eileen mentioned the problem with foreign bureaus. I mean, what about the resources of local television is really struggling. Government. Yes, covering state, and so much happens at state government, and so much when you have the idea pushed at Washington, federalism, we're going to devolve decision making to the states. Well, who's watching it? So it's really important.
Take that back. Another risk is the risk of generative AI. I've been dealing with a lot of AI at my college. Students are very fond of ChatGPT, and separate from all the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. But this is a real threat. It's happening right now. How should the news industry handle this threat of, the internet just getting flooded with information that is completely false? It's going to be some computer scientists say it's going to be very hard in the near future to find fact-based information on the internet. Who wants to take it?
We're doing a lot of studying at the Rockefeller Foundation and I've been studying disinformation since about 2004, and I think those two things are very integrated. I also think that AI is dangerous from an economic model for journalists. I mean, just as it is for actors and editors and any creative entity. And so I think it's really going to take society, and I worry about this, is that it's in the company's interest. And I think you were absolutely right that advertising dollars going to responsible news organizations is going to be important. Similarly, I think the way businesses get together and start working with government to put guardrails around AI. How is it going to be deployed in the workforce? How can we put copyright information? How do you make sure that the information going into ChatGPT is good because, as computer scientists will say, junk in, junk out. And so we have a real problem. We already know that a lot of big data has gender bias, has racial bias, has all sorts of bias, and that's related to that junk in, junk out. So the more we recede from truth, the worse AI is going to get us in society. So I think it's going to be really important from that point of view.
Yeah, I'll just say I recently had the opportunity to spend some time with one of the leading innovators in AI, Mustafa Soleimani. He's written a book about warning of some of the dangers, and a fascinating conversation with him about, you know, how the next basically 18 months could be entirely transformative because the growth and the capabilities of AI is growing exponentially, and he was envisioning a world where vast numbers of white collar professionals are basically put out of work. Lawyers, accountants, this is work that can all be done. And I said, well, I'm interested. I was like, this can't be journalists, right? Because we have to develop relationships. We have to make phone calls. We have to, and he's like, oh no, it'll be able to do that too. It'll be able to make phone calls too.
Also, I can make an avatar of you like in that.
Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, actually, there is. They call it the best campaigner because they can make thousands of calls simultaneously to donors, for a political campaign. This AI campaign volunteer. So
well,
yeah, it's already out there.
The effect on our politics is really profound because it will be able to spread disinformation in so much more quickly. It'll be able to create the impression among kind of grassroots political activism that you're actually communicating with the individual politician, and it's not. This goes far beyond just the danger of deep fakes.
That's
This is
right.
something that can funnily transform our politics if the wrong people have access to it.
That's right. And some of the more responsible companies like OpenAI say that, well, we're not going to allow our platform to be used for that, but there are a lot of other copycat programs out there, so we have to be careful. And not to mention that you mentioned deep fakes. You can now create a video from a photograph. You can now add something that didn't happen in the middle of a real video or at the end of it. So it's going to become increasingly difficult to determine really what is reality, what is truth and reality.
Well, Russia's using it in Ukraine. I mean, Russia has used it in Ukraine, and press reports manipulating footage.
I want to go back, Eileen, to what you mentioned about the weaponization of laws against journalists. There definitely have been some new interpretations of existing laws. You're our resident legal expert. You mentioned the unitary executive. This is becoming very popular now among the Republicans and Trump, and actually turning even the Justice Department against journalists. What do we need to know about this? This is a looming threat, perhaps, if the election goes one way.
Well, I think that this is happening also across the globe. The more authoritarian a government is, the more that likely they are to be fighting any kind of independent journalism because they want to control the media, they want to control the truth. I mean, every war zone I was ever in, one of the main battles was always around the TV station. When you talk about Vilnius and in Latvia, people died around the TV station, and I was there. And same thing in Russia during the coup in '93. So and in Romania during the fall of communism, that was the main battle because the main battle is for truth. So the thing is about the laws is that I think what's going to have to happen is that, again, the main institutions in society, and this is what's crazy, is that people are going to have to rally around. I'm glad that Pew said freedom of speech, freedom of the press is important, but dig deeper about that. And I think the fact is that society is going to have to basically fight against any kind of rules or laws that limit that freedom of the press. And the same thing, I think, with companies, because if there is say, for example, a sort of an effort to shut down ABC News, which is owned by a big conglomerate, or to control the news, then, in many countries, authoritarian countries, where, big corporations own the media, what happens is the government tries to inflict economic damage on them. And that's how they end up controlling it, not even by the laws. So I think it's going to be the resistance of businesses and investors and society that's going to have to be able to fight back against any kinds of laws. I don't know how you pass a press freedom law in today's conditions right now. Because we're so divided. But I do think that if a more rigorous law against freedom of the press is attempted to be passed, maybe that is when people will kind of surge around freedom of the press.
And what about the business community? What could the business community do around this issue? Damon, what do you see?
Again, I think, as we work through our industry and trade groups, we are routinely sitting down with groups of elected leaders, and I think it requires a careful articulation of how these issues collectively impact society. Right? It's not every corporation can weigh in on everything that may or may not be within their specific area of expertise. But I do think when we're gathered together and we're talking about where the country is going, there's an element of stay in your lane, but we all have lanes that are our 9 to 5s, and then we have our 5 to 9s. So it does require companies to have a conscience.
And I do think Americans trust business leaders more than journalists. There was a recent poll done by that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think with our business leaders' voices, we go to such lengths to protect that. And I think there could be the media that I speak with have a real fear of, the bullying that's taking place and the trolling on the online profiles. And, I think that's becoming a more looming threat. And we actually employ a lot of these technologies to protect our leaders in the online space. And I think a more open dialogue, and, I've worked for some very sophisticated brands who've done this in the cyber field. And I think that more open dialogue between both the in-house and the media outlets could really help.
And I just want to wrap up about the role of the press, and it's important to society, how to educate the public about that. What can we do? And everyone can take this. How can we educate the public on how important it is to protect our core press freedoms?
Well, I mean, I'll just say when the phrase "enemy of the people" was first aimed at the press by the person with the loudest megaphone arguably on the planet, that I felt it was very important to push back in a way of just pointing out that a powerful politician being angry with the press is nothing new. It's not new in American history at all. Our presidents, dating back to Washington, had big problems with the press, complained viciously about the press. We all remember Thomas Jefferson, who said, given a choice between living in a country with a government but no press, or one with press and no government, he would take the latter. Well, later he said nothing can be believed that it's written in a newspaper. So Jefferson himself had massive complaints about a press. But the bottom line is that we have seen throughout history that a functioning and free press is essential to a representative democracy. It's not just there's a reason why we're in the fourth estate room. It is absolutely essential, and I think that message needs to be reinforced by providing information that our viewers and our readers see as important and valuable, and showing that we are, doing our jobs in terms of holding those in power to account.
I'll be a little bit. I think it's civic education. What is the role of the press? I also do think, though, that the press has to. I think there is a lot. With all due respect, I think we've gotten too siloed and too insular, and there's too much of not actually going out into, because of expenses, of going out and covering what people are really suffering from. There is a huge economic divide in this country. 40% of full-time workers in this country do not have $200 in savings. 40%. They work full-time. and they can't afford to go to the emergency room. They don't have health care. And so we don't understand that. You have a party last election who didn't even put up a policy platform because it didn't matter. Because we have people, with all due respect, just talking at desks about who's up, who's down. There is never a graphic anymore about this is what this party is saying about healthcare and this is what this party. You have a party that says get rid of Obamacare and has yet to put up a policy platform. And with all due respect, I think we got to get out of Washington and New York and get out and show people that actually the press really cares about what they care about. And it isn't about personalities. It isn't about, who's up, who's down. It's about bread and butter issues. It's about how do I get my kid to school? How do I keep a job? How do I actually make a living? And I think we got to cover that better. So, and I'm still a journalist. I still consider myself even a former journalist, so.
I'd simply add that as I think we think about all of the audiences who matter to us as a company, our employees, our consumers, our customers, our share owners, and society, we can't look at all of those as 5 independent groups. We're not going to be successful with any one of those groups unless we're successful with them all. And I think a free operating press is part of society, right? So as we look at what we do, what we support, where our dollars go, much like we're supporting this there, I think we need to continue to figure out, much like Cameron said, how are ways in which we fuel the next generation of storytellers, no matter how they tell their stories.
And thank you for your support for organizations like this.
Yeah, I would end by saying, every relationship, it can be repaired. I took this role, and I often joke with my team, it's BC before Cameron. And there may have been a lot of relationships with journalists that just they had given up on. And I feel like that's the wrong attitude. And I have really pursued that and asked my team to pursue that in the spirit of looking at the relationship that you have with media in order to help tell their story. And that is worth the repairing. That is worth the access. It is worth every time and cent and money we put into newsrooms and tours and on the background briefings. And I feel like that's one of the most key ways to continue to help this information flow in a very authentic way. Otherwise, you come into it with a mindset and it's not going to be a win-win for either side. It's going to be a terrible story that's highly influential and damaging to the brand that actually helped it, in the first place.
Well, let's end it on that somewhat hopeful note. And I just want to leave you with one thought. When press freedom is attacked, it's an attack on us because press freedom is our freedom. And I'd like to thank our panel and our wonderful audience, and let's continue this conversation.